Hey everyone, welcome to Professor Long's Lectures in Anatomy and Physiology. I'm Professor Bob Long. If you guys have been following my videos, you know that the videos are intended for the students who are enrolled in my courses at Del Mar College. If you're not enrolled in my class, then your instructor may cover different structures, include some that we don't have, exclude some that we do have on our list. We all do things a little bit differently based on the equipment that we have and what we think is important for our students. So please make sure you learn the structures that your instructor wants you to learn. The ones that I cover today are for my students off of our list of things to know, or what we call the laboratory guide. I call it the list of things to know because this is what you need to know for the test. We'll be following along on page 20 on the list of things to know. I had a previous video that was a short intro that showed you the large mannequin. Now we're going to zoom in on the nasal and the oral cavity and the beginnings of the respiratory tree. So I hope you can see this stuff just fine. I know that I'm kind of zoomed in, so my head may be bigger than the screen or may not be in the screen. I got a face made for radio, so who cares anyway. So when I look at this model, a few things stand out. We can obviously see the nose, the opening. If I lay this model a little bit flat, there's an opening here. That opening is called the external nares. Nares is singular, so there's one. You actually have two called the external nares. But this would be the external nares, the opening here. Now, all of this space right here that arches up and starts to narrow down is called the nasal cavity. The nasal cavity has a few structures in it. These three mounds of tissue, they're three pieces of bone that we learned on the skull called the nasal conchae. And I know they're supposed to be pronounced conchae, but it just sounds funny to me. So, the superior nasal concha, the middle nasal concha, and the inferior nasal concha are those three bumps. And they're covered with some flesh and some mucus, and they can trap dirt and debris, and they create turbulence so the air swirls around, and we can filter out all the trash. Now, underneath each concha is a passageway. This passageway here, here, and here. Each passageway is called a meatus. This one up here would be called the superior meatus. This passageway would be called the middle meatus, and this is the inferior meatus. Now, after the passageways, after the air flows through them, you can see that the nasal cavity narrows down to this little spot right about here. There's almost a little line here, or it's the opening between these 2 points, about where this piece of bone ends and where that piece of bone is. This opening right here that goes from the nasal cavity into this tube is called the internal nares. So we have the external nares here, the nasal cavity, and then the internal nares would be this little area or region right here. Once air passes from the nasal cavity into through the internal nares, it's going to funnel through this tube here that leads down. Now, before I get to that tube, I want to show you this. We have the oral cavity here, you have the labia, you have the teeth, this space in here is called the vestibule. We may or may not learn that when we do the digestive system. You have the tongue here. One of the structures that we will see is called the lingual frenulum, and it's this little loop of tissue that connects your tongue to the floor of your mouth. So if you ever stick your tongue to the roof of your mouth and open your mouth wide, that little piece of that little wire or line of string that looks like it's underneath the flesh, that's called the lingual frenulum. Okay. Now, as air can also pass through the oral and the nasal cavity, it will enter this tube called the pharynx, Pharynx. And the pharynx actually has three regions. Before I get into the individual regions of the pharynx, let me show you two other things. First, we have the palate. The palate is the wall or area that separates the nasal and the oral cavities. The oral cavity, by the way, is also known as the buccal cavity, B-U-C-C-A-L. Some people even say buccal cavity. The oral cavity and the nasal cavity are separated by this border called the palate. Wherever there is bone here is called the hard palate. This would be the soft palate where there's some muscle tissue, and then the tip of the soft palate is a structure called the uvula or uvula. It's the little punching bag that hangs in the back of your throat. So that's the uvula. Hard palate, soft palate, and uvula. By the way, the hard palate is mostly maxillary bones till we get to the very end, and then it turns into the palatine bones where it gets its name. Those details you don't have to worry about. Now, Air is supposed to flow through the nasal cavity. Food, drink, and air can flow through the oral cavity. Now the opening from the oral cavity into this tube, between this structure, which is the uvula, and there's a flap in here called the epiglottis. Now you can't really see the epiglottis very well because I have these things blocking it, which is the second thing I wanted to show you. This is called the thyroid cartilage, this blue structure right here. The thyroid cartilage is the covering to your voice box. The voice box is also called the larynx, L-A-R-Y-N-X, not larynx, but larynx. The larynx is the entire voice box, okay? By the way, this is the hyoid bone that we learned in part 1 A&P. This is called the thyrohyoid ligament because it goes from the thyroid cartilage to the hyoid bone. But the thyroid cartilage is this cartilage here. If I pull the thyroid cartilage off, there are structures inside the larynx as well. So I'm going to remove the thyroid cartilage. This big flap of flesh here, this flesh-colored structure, is called the epiglottis. And it is literally a flap of tissue that has some muscle in it that can come down and close over here. So the reason it does that is because if you see the pharynx is the tube that goes from the internal nares all the way down to about the base of the epiglottis, or right about here. Now, the pharynx itself is divided into 3 regions. As air passes through the internal nares into the upper part of the pharynx, from the internal nares to the tip of the uvula, is called, this part of the passageway, sorry, give me a second. I apologize for that interruption. Somebody thought it would be really brilliant to save the planet and have lights that turn off automatically if there's not enough movement in the room. So if they go off from time to time on me, I just have to move and they'll turn back on. I apologize for that interruption. Anyway, so now, this area, this part of the tube or passageway is known as the nasopharynx, and it extends from the internal nares to the tip of the uvula. Now, as air and food and drink pass from the oral cavity into the pharynx, the opening from the tip of the uvula to the tip of the epiglottis here, just this opening is called the fauces. It's F-A-U-C-E-S. The fauces, if you made someone go, ah, and you look in the back of their mouth, you would see the ring of flesh, and then you would see into the pharynx. You'd see the uvula, and you might see the tonsils. That ring or area would be this little ring here that would go around. That would be the fauces. As air and food and drink pass through the fauces, it enters into this part of this tube, part of the pharynx, called the oropharynx. So this section or region of this tube is called the oropharynx. We have the nasopharynx connected to the nasal cavity, the oropharynx connected to the oral cavity. Now, I don't know if you can see this, but the tube that goes, this part of the tube that goes from the tip of the epiglottis to the base of the epiglottis is called the laryngopharynx because of the larynx here. This is the internal structures of the larynx. So this is the laryngopharynx, this specific part of this tube. Now, I don't know if you can see it very well or not, but I'm going to tilt this way. There are 2 tubes running next to each other here. The pharynx at the at the laryngopharynx splits into 2 passageways. One of them is designed for food and drink to go down, which is called the esophagus, and the esophagus would lead down to the stomach. The other tube runs through here and comes out through this pipe, which is called the trachea, the beginning of the trachea. The opening from the the opening from the laryngopharynx into the larynx is called the glottis. It's this opening here. And we have another model, I'll show it to you better on that model, but that's called the glottis. This flap that closes the glottis when we swallow, so food and drink are forced into the esophagus and can't damage the lungs, is called the epiglottis. That's this flap of tissue here. Epiglottis means above the glottis. The glottis is the opening. Now, when I remove the thyroid cartilage, I can see that the larynx has a lot of musculature in here for moving our vocal cords, for helping us speak and make inflections. Below the thyroid cartilage is a large cartilage here called the cricoid cartilage. These individual blue rings are called tracheal cartilages or C rings, and the pipe would be called the trachea. Now the tracheal cartilages, if I turn this back this way, they're not complete circles. They are shaped like the letter C, and the backside has some connective tissue. The reason is they help support the airway so that it doesn't collapse on itself. But they are separated by some ligaments here so that we can flex our head and move it around, kind of like those old microphone stands, so that it's flexible. But it prevents it from being crushed easily. On the back side, we have the vertebrae protecting it, so we just have a little ligament back here. But that separates, or helps us separate, that food and drink can go down to the esophagus, and air can go down into the trachea, eventually leading to our lungs. So now, quick review. We have a few more structures. We're going to move on to another model. We have the external nares, the opening to your nostril, the nasal cavity, the superior, middle, and inferior nasal concha, the superior, middle, and inferior meatus, the passageways. I have the hard palate, the soft palate, and the uvula. The opening right here would be called the internal nares. This tube is called the pharynx. The oral cavity will empty into the pharynx through the fauces, the gap between the uvula and this epiglottis here. Now, this part of the tube is called the nasopharynx. This part of the tube is called the oropharynx, and then we have the laryngopharynx. Once the laryngopharynx ends at the base of the epiglottis, we either have the trachea or the esophagus. I can see the cricoid cartilages here. The individual pieces are called tracheal cartilages or C-rings, and the tube would be called the trachea. The opening, by the way, is the glottis. We have the epiglottis here, and I removed the thyroid cartilage from the front. Okay. Now, if I look in the nasopharynx and in the oropharynx, there's a few prominent structures you should see. One of them is this little groove, and this groove has an opening that leads to the tube that goes to our ear. If you remember when we studied the ear, we had what's called the pharyngotympanic tube, also called the auditory tube or eustachian tube. The reason it's called the pharyngotympanic tube is because it extends from the nasopharynx all the way up to the tympanic cavity. So that's the opening. This opening here would be the opening of the pharyngotympanic tube. You could also write auditory tube. You could also write eustachian tube on the test, and they're all correct. Now, if I look at the back wall, this little rough spot is one of our tonsils. We actually have 3 sets of tonsils that surround the opening of this passageway. And the reason they're there is because tonsils are essentially lymph nodes. And lymph nodes are little lumps of nodules of tissue that have a lot of lymphocytes in them. When we studied white blood cells, you know that lymphocytes can secrete antibodies, and they can alert other white blood cells to come attack any foreign invader. And since we are breathing in all sorts of bacteria and viruses and fungi and parasites in through here, it makes sense that we have these lymph nodes, these tonsils and adenoids, which if a bacterium or virus gets in, they become rather inflamed because they're going to start secreting antibodies and trying to attack these things for what we would call an upper respiratory infection. This particular one here is called the pharyngeal tonsil. The pharyngeal tonsil is also known as the adenoid. So when people have their tonsils removed, the surgery can be called TNA procedure, tonsil and adenoid removal, or tonsillectomy and adenoidectomy. This is called the adenoid or the pharyngeal tonsil. Now, if I go to the end of the uvula here, this red looking nodule right here, this round or oval mass right here, is called the palatine tonsil because it's at the end of the palate. And the palatine tonsils are usually the ones that you can see when you look in the back of someone's throat. There's actually a little nodule right here, or a little piece of tissue. It's not on your list, so you don't have to know it, called the lingual tonsil. It's at the base of your tongue. When you get a sore throat or an infection, they get inflamed and swollen, and they hurt. They look really bad. They get really red. That's why doctors want to look back there and see if you have a throat infection. Okay, so this would be the pharyngeal tonsil or the adenoid. This would be called the palatine tonsil. So that should conclude this model for you for now. We're going to go on and we're going to look at a model that is a continuation of this. So I hope you had as much fun as I did. I hope you learned something. Sorry about the light thing. I'm trying to avoid that, but I can't help it. And do this stuff till you can't stand it. Do it till you understand it. Do it till you can teach it to someone else. See you in the next video.